Okay. It is my honor and privilege to introduce one of the most controversial geologists and just a great human being, Dr. Robert Schoch.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here, and thank you, Walter, very much for making this possible over the years. And once again, it's really nice to be here and see both a lot of old friends and also new faces. So I'm really pleased to be back. I'm going to talk for, I'm told, until no later than 12:30. So we can have lunch. But what I want to say in that is that many of us always feel we can have more time, so I'm going to try to cover some things very quickly, and I'll be happy to take questions if we don't have time at the end now. But, you know, just stop by, talk to me during lunch. I'll be here the entire session. A lot of you know that I'm a geologist, as John West, who's somewhere in the audience, would say. I geologize. It's just a picture of me geologizing, collecting rock samples. So I really do this. This is in Peru in particular. But what many of you are aware is that I'm probably best known in certain circles for my work on the Sphinx. I'm only going to mention that very briefly because I sort of feel like I have to, because in many ways it does set the stage for what we're here about at this conference on precession, ancient knowledge, and really pushing things way back. And this work that goes back almost 2 decades now for myself personally really set the stage for much of what has come later. And I'm not claiming any credit here, I'm giving credit to the Sphinx. And it's also changed my life. Usually I think for the better, sometimes I wonder what I got myself into. So I really started on the Sphinx work when I was very young. This is me about 20 years ago. And what it really indicated doing, at least for some people, and this was part of the controversy and part of why we're here now, is talking about, you know, if you push the day of the Sphinx back, does it mean that we have to view history differently? Do we have to rewrite history? And that's what's been suggested by many people, maybe, you know, including myself at this point. I've never actually seen it that way in the sense that, well, okay, we have to rewrite things, we push things back. But I'm a geologist, I think in terms of long time periods anyway. So a few thousand years, what's the big deal? Well, I found out very quickly it's a real big deal to a lot of historians and Egyptologists. Just very quickly about my Sphinx work, here is the Sphinx, and tie in with the talk we just presentation we just heard. I've actually always thought of her as having a feminine energy. But maybe she's androgynous, whatever. We won't get into that now. But she sits in her Sphinx enclosure, and what I've been working on as far as the Sphinx go, or basically this short version of the story, is you look at the enclosure. This is the body of the Sphinx. What we're really interested in from a geological point of view is the weathering, the erosion that we see on the body of the Sphinx and on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, because that's really where it's much better preserved. We saw that was preserved by sand. And the bottom line is, you study this carefully, it's caused by rain, it's caused by precipitation. And it's very clear. I mean, this is textbook geology, as many geologists have said to me when I present it. There's nothing very sophisticated here, and that compares to the type of weathering you see elsewhere on the plateau, which is caused by wind, basically wind gouging out the soft layer. Very different type of weathering. Wind erosion on the right versus rain erosion. This is the bottom line I could talk about for 3 hours in great detail, but I'm not going to today. So wind versus rain. And what's the implications of this? The implication is that for the last 5,000 plus years, from dynastic times basically up to the present, we have only had hyper-arid conditions. Very little rain, less than a couple of centimeters a year nowadays, just not the amount of rain to get the erosion that you see on the body of the Sphinx in the Sphinx enclosure. So you just don't have it. It just doesn't make sense. But we know geologically, and this is well established, that it was a very different environment before 3000 BC. This, according to this diagram, 7000 to 3000 BC, you have much more temperate, moist cloud cover, savanna type conditions. Before that, you have a dry period going back in time, wet, dry, etc. So you have to push it back geologically to at least this earlier period, and you have to have it far enough back to be able to see the level of erosion that you see now. That's the bottom line without going into great detail. So it goes back by my best estimates, and not just based on surface weathering, but subsurface weathering also, at least to 5,000 BC, a couple of thousand years earlier, could be much older than that, in fact. But conservatively, I've always said it's at least 5,000 BC, and that's enough to upset, I guarantee you, a lot of Egyptologists. This was incredibly radical. A lot of people claimed I had no context for this 18, 20 years ago. Since then, in the last 2 decades, more and more information's been coming out from established archaeology, et cetera. For instance, I mentioned this one in particular, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. And here we have a good German archaeologists in particular have been working on this, and they are finding, lo and behold, what they call major building phases from the same period in time. So I feel in many ways, and this is just one example. We're getting more and more around the world where you get incredible structures, carvings from this same Sphinx age. I'll call it the Sphinx age period. So now we are no longer talking isolation for this very early period. So in many ways, I feel after all that abuse I've taken over the years, at least starting to be vindicated. I've looked at the geology so thoroughly and had so many people come after me and criticize it. In many cases, only to say, well, I'm talking to my geological colleagues. They say, well, in fact, you're right. I'm certain it will stand up to the test of time. So given that, let's move on from there. This is sort of my own personal history. The Sphinx is very old indeed. And I believe that, as we've heard already, we've been talking about, and we'll talk more about this conference, you're talking about very ancient advanced civilization at a much earlier period in time, and you're talking about lost knowledge. And I think lost knowledge and lost wisdom. So this really set me on a quest, which I've been going on ever since, which I'm certainly not at the end of. I've traveled around now for the last 20 years to a number of areas. This is in Peru. We've already heard quite a bit about Peru. This is actually a very interesting spot known as Marcahuasi, which I'm planning to get back to with some of the people in the audience in early next year. Incredible site. In fact, something that you have here is similar to what we were talking about before. These almost like a proto-sculptures, proto-structures. And also, it's many of these sacred sites, let me say this right now, have people experience things there. They have very powerful experiences, if I could use that term. And we'll come back to that. So this is Marcahuasi, some of the people that visited earlier. This is known as the Healing Cross or Sacred Cross. In Marcahuasi, it's hard to tell, but if I go back just a little bit in this picture, I would fall off a major cliff and not be here to tell you about. But many of these have geomagnetic anomalies. I'll come back to that also, and seem to affect people's consciousness. Classic example, slide I took when I was last there, Machu Picchu. We've already heard a bit about Machu Picchu. But I'm really looking at these from both a geological perspective and why are they building there in the way why are they building the way they are? Nazca lines, I won't get into that now. Even in other parts, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but the Eastern, not just in the Americas, I want to say, but also in the so-called Old World. This is a site actually in Wales, burial mound, Scotland, Bosnia. Don't worry about Bosnia too much. That pyramid is not a real pyramid. But it's still a very interesting site diving off of this. Some people are familiar with this, Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan. But coming back to Egypt, let's talk